Alright, in part 2 of the Les Paul restore video here, we just wanted to take the guitar apart, get it stabilized, try and date it, get some other expert opinions, and then figure out how to repair it as I'm making sure I understand what is or isn't broken. So I spent some time trying to date this, and the guitar body has 2 holes for a tailpiece that used to be holding up the bridge. We think that this was converted in the 60s. The tuners look like they've been replaced because I've got a screw that got broken off in the hole here. And I'm assuming someone had replaced the tuners because these tuners date a little bit later than some of the other parts. The control knobs are the thicker, taller control knobs. And I also have got a thinner one. So that to me, in some of the readings, says that this was a 53. It's got a really shallow neck angle, 2.5 degrees. This bridge was actually shaved down, sanded down to fit this. One of the pots, an IRC pot, was dated to 53 on the codes that I could find. And then when I talked to George Gruen and sort of explain what I'm doing and what happened with this guitar, he's like, 3-piece, unfigured maple top, and I was like, yep. He's like, that's usually the telltale sign. So I think it's a 53. Owner says it's a 53, so we're gonna go with that. And then as we took this apart here in the video, just wanted to see what is and isn't stable, and what can we work with and what can we not work with. I talked to Greg at Gruen Guitars, and the big concern we have in part 3 is that if we back cut this out, that this maple top will fall apart. So we got to use some super glue to stabilize everything. I used yellow glue to glue the headstock on because of all the Bondo that was in there, and sometimes hide glue can be a little bit brittle. So I don't need it cracking as I'm doing some of the cleanup work. But we'll get into the video here and show you guys where I'm at. So for gluing on the neck, there's a lot of sort of excess Bondo on here, and I need to clean it off. And sometimes when you're doing this, you can take some additional wood chunks out. So I'm trying to be really careful to get some of the Bondo out so I can get good wood on wood contact. And with this, I want to get this on, let it dry for a while. And as I was playing with it, I was tempted to use hide glue, but since there's so many open gaps and hide glue could be a little bit brittle at times, I decided to go with just regular Titebond. Plus I need to do some work and cut some of this stuff still too. So I'm gonna glue a piece of veneer on the back to hide the crack, and then I have to resaw the head plate off. I want to reuse the original inlay on the new headstock plate that I'm going to put on. So I want to really make sure that this is on and it's dry before I bring this to the saw or router. I haven't figured out exactly how to get this off yet. So we do a couple dry runs, see how this fits, make sure I've got all the flakes of Bondo off. And then I pulled the nut off and the washer as well. And you can see right here as I'm trying to clean some of this off, I realize there's another crack on the side. And that's when I realized I have to flip off the fretboard at this point too. There's a crack that's running off that piece through the fretboard. So I'm going to get my glue and get it into the joint. So the Bondo really does hide a bunch of cracks. And as I was playing with the body, you'll see further on, there's just cracks all over this. So I want to get this stabilized, get it in, and then add some extra pieces of wood to reinforce all of these cracks. So we'll put glue on the headstock, on the neck itself. Try and get it all into the nooks and crannies. And the Bondo really causes some issues because you can't see everything. So this headstock actually cracked off twice. First time was the original break, and then second time was after it was all glued up and Bondoed. So I've got just a bit of a mess here. So it's in, got a couple clamps. Got one more clamp then to bring the fretboard back into the neck here. There's that crack running up the side of the neck, which really is not a good crack at all. Once I realized that, I knew I had to take off the fretboard to actually run an extra piece of wood through that crack because there's Bondo and it's real messy. And we'll go live in video here as we're super gluing some of the body up and just kind of see it as it is as I'm doing some of the work. Alright, a lot of you guys that don't understand are going to freak out why I'm using super glue. That's why I'm filming this live. I guess when this was stepped on, he glued some of it back and there's Bondo everywhere, but the problem is that there's tons of cracks running through this side of the body yet. So what I'm going to do is use this Glue Boost Ultra Thin and make sure that all these cracks are sealed so that way the body doesn't ripple. And you can see how the glue gets absorbed. That's why I'm doing this. There's a huge crack here. And it runs maybe about 3/4 of the way. And once I finish adding this, I'll clamp it this way. Oh, this is so messy. There's cracks over here. I just don't want this to start moving after I've done all this work and finishing and then have it move. So we're gonna get a clamp and just push it like that. So as I clamp this, I can actually see this close up. It's a good sign. I'm hoping the other super glue I dropped down the side then seals that up. So if you're an armchair quarterback, this is why I'm doing this. There's a big crack and I want this to seal up. I'll do that with the maple top here too. There's cracks here. Got to stabilize the wood before I do anything. As I put the glue here, I can see it just streaking down here. So I'll put a clamp right here, see if I can get that to close slightly. Really hope I don't have to take off the neck. That's now my new worry. Got a piece of basswood and some tape. Place this here. Clamp this down. Lots of Bondo in this control cavity, and once the glue dried for 3 or 4 days, gotta just chip some of this out, and I need to be able to see what I'm working with. So just some light tapping and seeing how much I can get out. This actually was a little bit of a process, so So pulling the frets are what's up next. These frets were destroyed. They were corroded and messy, and it was ugly. The first couple frets came out okay, but as I moved further up the neck, I had a significant problem. This took a lot longer than I thought, and I couldn't really grab underneath the fret. And even heating this up, it really didn't do all that much. So it was just really messy. And then I want to have some guide pins for where the fretboard's going to go back in. These early Gibsons did not have the standard guide pins like the newer Gibsons have today. So I'm going to pull this loose inlay out and drill 2 holes so I get the fretboard exactly in the same spot for the neck. None of these other fretboard inlays would come out, so what I wanted to do is have one on the top of the board, one on the bottom of the board, and that just wasn't going to happen. So I tried to use a razor blade or something to get underneath there, and I didn't want to damage anything, so I used a little bit of heat, see if anything would come loose, and nothing was coming up, and I don't want to force an inlay out. So I thought if I got an X-Acto knife, I could get underneath it, and that wasn't happening. So we get a little bit of a punch, tap down on 2 different sides of the inlay, and we'll just use that same inlay as our guide. And I'll use an 1/8 inch bit on the outsides of the inlay, and then I'll just use a dowel when I glue this in later, and then put the inlay in over that. So this keeps everything in the same spot. Usually you have a pin at the top of the fretboard and one at the bottom. All the newer Gibsons have that. This one does not. So the 2 will help. Then we're going to move to taking off the fretboard, which was definitely a huge undertaking. I didn't think it would take this long. Did not want to use steam. Did not want to introduce steam into the fretboard. This is Brazilian rosewood, and I just wanted to use a little bit of heat to see if I could get it to come up. And when I used heat to try and get the inlays out, I could tell it darkened up the inlay just slightly, so I don't want to actually use too much heat. Don't want to burn the inlays. So what I do is I have the heating pad, and I just start it up on the top, and I get a razor blade in there, and as it was heated up, it just pulled a little bit up, and so we just sort of work it over and move down the neck. I actually have a genius way of doing this as I move through it, and you'll see that here in a second. So this is the heat pad, and this is a pretty big heat pad, and it's a little bit messy. So this session loosened up the fretboard just enough, and what I decided to do was then take a soldering iron and attach that to a razor blade, and that allowed me to move up the fretboard relatively quickly. And then this is my ingenious device where I had a soldering iron clamped to a car door opener, Slim Jim or whatever, and I had 2 soldering irons, and I just heated up the fretboard and pulled this down. So about 45 minutes in total. But this actually worked really, really well. If I was smart at this point, I would patent this and make my own somehow. But this heated up the piece of metal, and it just slowly pulled off the fretboard. It's actually pretty nice. So then we're going to steam the neck off. I was hoping that I could just use the same method as before and take like a hot piece of metal into the neck and it would do it, but no, you got to use steam to pull the neck off with the hide glue. So the neck on the other Les Paul took a while with that glue. I think it was like 3 hours. This was about an hour with a Wagner wallpaper remover, and I drilled 1 extra hole and then tape off the body so it doesn't get too wet. So like 15 years ago, we were renovating a house that had a ton of wallpaper, and this little tool has been awesome, not only to
pull off wallpaper, but to pull off guitar necks. So I bought some a feeler gauge online, and I was just trying to use as little steam as possible, and I was taking this feeler gauge to try and break the seam so I didn't have to leave the steam on here forever. And it just wasn't doing it, so we had to steam more. A little bit of water condensing on the body. And lots of steam on my camera. So we tested just how this was going. Tried to tap in just sort of to break that seal. This was after about, I think, 30 minutes. Again, I didn't want to use all that steam. And a clean towel locks in the steam on the system. Here's the pull off after another hour. And my camera was foggy, and I just popped this out. Way easy. Once that glue releases, it just comes right off. So we'll clean this off. Make sure all the glue's off, and then the trick is to let this sit for a while, let it reacclimate back in shape. So I have this clamped down in the shop, and we got to let this stuff sit. So I'll put some weights on the body, and then just let this dry out for about 3 or 4 weeks before I do anything else. So now we're just going to wait. This was part 2. Part 3, we'll start repairing all this stuff now that we got it apart. Thanks for watching, guys. See you in the next video.